can go ahead and start. I have 40 minutes and will probably be speaking for most of that time based on how much material I have to share with you today. But my name is Cassandra. I'm here from Sabancı University, which is in Istanbul, Turkey. And I'm here to talk about actually the issue of cognitive load in higher education more generally, and then discuss some strategies for fostering the development of skills which are useful for the digital age and the information economy, basically. Okay, so just to give an overview of what I'm going to cover, there's basically 3 broad sections, and I might speak a little bit fast just to get through everything. But I want to talk about Gen Z as a starting point, since most of our learners, if we're working in higher education settings, are going to be Gen Z. Hi there, welcome. How are you? We just started. Hi. Hi there. Oh.
I should be looking at it.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to be up here.
Okay.
So 10 minutes more time, 5 minutes, and then stop.
Okay, great. And out of total time, is that for the full session or? Yeah, okay. Okay, great. Okay, so I have 3 main sections that I want to cover today. One is, who is Gen Z? Since most of our learners are Gen Z. And particularly, what sorts of characteristics define them, how are they perceived, and what sort of challenges and opportunities do they face. Then I want to shift to talking about cognitive load theory in education, so what it means in terms of processing capacity for learning, and also have a look at the mental health considerations briefly for that. And then we'll shift to I'll share with you some strategies for optimizing learning for the knowledge economy, what that means for curriculum design, what that means for managing the input stream, and also what that means with the advent of generative AI and these emergent technologies. Okay, so first of all, let me talk about who are Gen Z. And probably you're aware that, every generation tends to have some defining characteristics that are shaped by the circumstances that they grow up in. So for Gen Z, so for any generation, this is going to affect also what they value in a working environment and also how they prefer to communicate. So for Gen Z, what this means is the 2 kind of main defining circumstances for them are the economic situation, particularly Great Recession, also the economic situations that define our current situation. Also the access to technology from a young age. They're known as being constantly connected, constantly distracted, and in terms of what they value, diversity, creativity, and individuality, and they prefer to communicate over social media or DMs, which is kind of a shift from the previous generation from email. Okay, and I was at a conference about a year ago, and there was one of the sub-themes of that conference was Gen Z, actually. So there was a lot of discussion happening about everything related to teaching Gen Z learners. And a lot of what was coming out of that discussion was this perception that they're narcissistic, that they have a false sense of entitlement. And this tends to be kind of a common perception from older generations toward Gen Z, that they're more entitled without doing half the work. But I just want to put this in perspective a little bit, because of course the world has changed. And let me ask you, maybe by show of hands, when was the last time you were asked to recite a Shakespeare sonnet? Yeah, that's what I thought.
At a wedding. Yeah.
Use the quadratic formula? Yeah. Needed to balance your checkbook? Sent a fax? Okay, that last one's not one that is taught in school, of course, but for some reason, convention that still persists to this day. But the point that I want to show about this is that so much of the time that we spend in the classroom teaching skills or learning skills when we were in school ourselves is not really that useful in our day-to-day life. It doesn't mean that those things are not useful for some applications, but to spend so much time on it in university is not really so useful for the 21st century as maybe it was in the past. Okay, so I just also want to give a little bit more context about Gen Z. In terms of global challenges that they're facing, there's been moves toward more authoritarian regimes and a lot of geopolitical conflicts. We've seen that especially in the last year and a half. Extreme climate events, inequality, skyrocketing inflation. So of course for Gen Z, their main concerns are to make change in the world, especially about climate change. And a main challenge for them is economic concerns and concerns about the future more generally. I've also been doing some research about the mental health situation in my institution, and that is the trend that is coming out, that they're really concerned about what to do in the future, where to go from here. So the Deloitte Global Gen Z and Millennial Survey from last year found that almost half of Gen Zs and Millennials live paycheck to paycheck and worry about being able to cover their expenses. So this is the circumstances that surround their, transition from education into the professional world, let's say. And even, in the labor market, we've seen some dramatic changes. There's always kind of a pendulum going back and forth, shifts in the labor market conditions. But essentially, we have a shift even in this post-COVID era from an employee-driven market to one that is extremely competitive with great resignation. Probably you've heard some of these buzzwords before: quiet quitting, quiet firing, loud layoffs, career cushioning. So this is the climate that they find themselves in. And I personally, and maybe some of you can relate, have heard from a lot of my students, they're feeling overwhelmed because they don't feel like what we're spending time on in school, in university, is really that useful for entering this job market. And at the same time, the value of a college degree is getting less and less, and more expensive. So the average cost of a university degree has skyrocketed, basically since 1998, which is apparently when in the UK they started charging tuition, has risen 300%, and in the US since the 1980s, 500%, with an average debt of around 40 grand. And of course, if you're unable to pay it down, that debt just gets higher with time. That's what's happening now. And also at the same time, university is somehow becoming less effective at preparing students for professional life after university. So even in 2014, a Gallup poll found that only 10% of business leaders find that college graduates have the skills needed for the workplace. And at the same time, there are lots of new ways of getting those skills. So there's online courses, there's YouTube. You can learn lots of things from YouTube. Apprenticeships, some companies, especially tech companies, will even train you directly, like Google. And so in terms of thinking about the value of a college degree, also more people have college degrees. That's another part of this as well. So you're less competitive, you stand out less having a college degree in the first place. But the value really lies in efficiency and feedback. This is my point that I'm making. Because of course, if you teach yourself something online or YouTube or, apprenticeships, you would get that. But there's a lot more struggle or difficulty in kind of knowing what you need to learn in the first place and sequencing it and knowing what is going well and what needs improvement. So whereas previously the main kind of mantra for the skills that were useful to learn in school was the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, now we have the 4 C's. National Education Association came up with this framework in 2002, which is communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. So we see a shift toward more emphasis on these soft skills, these transferable skills that can be applied in a lot of situations. And now we also have AI in the mix. Even when I was preparing this presentation, I was seeing AI supports everywhere. So it's more of a skill to know how to work with that AI. And the main point here is that these new skills, which are more important in the 21st century, are distinct from traditional academic skills in that they're not primarily based in content knowledge, although of course that is useful. It's more about being able to process knowledge or know what to do with the knowledge in order to create something. So although the skills are not content knowledge based, there's more of an emphasis on creating content. So using these 4 C's to basically create something new, process information and create something new. So in terms of what it means to be skilled, we have a shift from where work used to be defined in terms of physical matter, moving it in space, delegating moving matter in space, to moving information and what is termed knowledge or increasingly creative work. So in this context, it's more valuable to be able to process information efficiently, a lot of information, to be able to parse out what's relevant, what's not, what's important, what's not, and to be able to collaborate with technology to produce exceptional output. So there's a lot of concern with the advent, with the emergence of ChatGPT, Bard, whatever Bing's chatbot is called, to basically do kind of take some of the burden of the work and then work with it to create something that's even better. So the question is not, is AI going to replace you, but someone with AI is going to replace you. And probably we're aware that there is a mental health crisis on our hands, a very serious one actually, which I started to notice personally around the pandemic time. I could see the effects, and that's when I started to investigate this issue, and that's what brought me to this cognitive load topic in the first place. So in order to understand, this is where I'm going to shift into the cognitive load part of this. I want to show you an example, maybe something that you can relate to. Let's imagine that you had a really long, hard day, you don't feel like doing any more effort, and you just want to order something to eat. It should be something really easy, but tell me how easy it is. And by the way, this is okay, I translated it into English, but this is a real screenshot from an app that we use in Turkey for ordering food. I was thinking about this topic, and then I opened this app and I thought, oh, that's exactly it. That's the problem. So something that should be an easy decision, something that should be easy to process is not. Why? Well, aside from the fact that, there's nothing in the titles of these burgers to indicate that they are different from each other in any meaningful way. There's a lot of redundant information. We have the same information in multiple places. It's just cluttering up our field of vision, and it's making this really difficult to make a decision. If we zoom in on what's actually important here, it's just that. Okay, so the definition of information overload or cognitive load, they're used interchangeably. They refer to the same phenomenon. According to the American Psychological Association Dictionary, it is this state that occurs when the amount or intensity of information exceeds individual processing capacity, leading to anxiety, poor decision-making, and other undesirable consequences. So, for instance, those mental health issues, which we'll return to in just a moment. So I want to kind of outline how this works in terms of learning, like how cognitive load factors in. The whole idea of cognitive load theory came from John Sweller in the 1980s, which was before really the internet took off, so you can only imagine how much more exacerbated it would be at this point. But the basic idea is this, that information is coming into our sensory experience after it's processed through our sensory filters. It enters into a working memory with a limited capacity, and only through a process of rehearsal can it be transferred into long-term memory, which crucially is unlimited. So once it's transferred into long-term memory and integrated into the schema, then it transforms that schema basically. If that rehearsal process doesn't happen, then it's just going to be forgotten. So if there's too much information and there's not enough rehearsal, that's what's going to happen. And what are the limits exactly to that working memory capacity? Does anyone have a guess? In terms of time or in terms of units of information?
So the standard time people can focus on a lecture, for example, is that about 30 minutes? Is that the kind of thing?
Yeah, that might be like, but I mean just information that you can hold at one given time before it gets transferred into long-term memory. So I think what you're referring to, I'm going to talk about that as well, actually. Yeah, I guess.
I mean, I don't know if this is the same, but I heard that it's about 6 or 8 things.
Yeah, 6 or 8 words
Words that
Mhm.
people
that you can retain and process at the same time.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. There's two ways of approaching this. On the one hand, in terms of time, I mean, the short answer is less than you think, probably. Less than 30 seconds. Not more than that, usually. In terms of just what can be held in the memory, just temporarily, basically. And then Miller, that what you're referring to, the slots or the chunking, that kind of idea, comes from Miller, 1956, which is plus or minus 7 slots, usually less. And coming back to your point just a moment ago, I think you're kind of referring, I think, to maybe just the ability to kind of sustain this over time. So first of all, in his book, Deep Work, Cal Newport refers to a study by Erickson in the 1998, which, I mean, he makes the point that, first of all, this hard focus capacity is a skill that needs to be consciously trained, just like you would go to the gym to work your muscles, and I mean, you do that regularly and they get stronger over time. You need to kind of work your mind to have this capacity to expand it. And the limits for that is, for someone who's less experienced, 1 hour, and remember, Gen Z is constantly distracted. It's hard for them, I mean, they're kind of known for having a short attention span. And for someone like a bodybuilder in hard focus, it would be 4 hours, rarely more. It doesn't mean you can't achieve things after that time, of course, but it does mean you're going to reach this point of diminishing returns where, regardless of the effort you're putting in, you're going to see less results, basically. And where does it come from? So, first of all, there's some factors that come from the task itself, which are how complex the task is, how much information is repeated unnecessarily, like that example I showed you a moment ago. And also time constraints can add to that. And also there's some factors coming from the learners. So lack of prior subject knowledge, lack of language proficiency, that's going to be a big one in our context. Lack of technical proficiency as well. Also how they feel about the subject and what they believe about learning. These are all factors that are going to affect how they manage or kind of experience cognitive load. And for Gen Z, since they're constantly connected and, I mean, now in the post-pandemic age, that everything in education has changed, become more technologically integrated as well. So that's also contributing to the load, and also the presence of just every manner of distractions, which is taking even that limited amount of time that they have and shredding it into time confetti, basically. And in terms of learning, and how this kind of relates to the mental health aspect and the emotional experience of learning, there are, I want to talk about learning-related emotions, which Pekroon puts on this continuum kind of activating, deactivating, positive and negative emotions. So kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum, the most positive activating emotion would be enjoyment. That would be a target emotion to achieve. And the negative deactivating one would be boredom, with anxiety also playing a pretty important role as an activating negative emotion. I just wanted to point out the opposite ends of the spectrum there. And of course, these emotions are being mediated by some other factors like attention, motivation, and self-regulation. So how skilled are our students, for example, at managing all the information that's coming in and not feeling overwhelmed by it, basically. And in the digital classroom, in the online classroom, probably any of us with experience teaching online would agree that there is a distinct overall emotional tone that differs from educational settings, traditional educational settings. There tends to be more boredom and anxiety and less enjoyment. Why? Well, as there's more cognitive load, it tends to increase boredom because, or affect boredom anyway, because when it's such an overwhelming amount of information, there tends to be this response of, well, I can't do it anyway, it's more than I can handle, why even try? So stop putting effort in. And that's going to affect how much they participate and therefore learn. And if they're experiencing anxiety, that can also increase the cognitive load. So, I mean, this can also result in like an anxiety cognitive load cycle or an anxiety avoidance cycle, which is just basically resulting in increased cognitive load. So what can we do? So here are the strategies that I want to share with you. First of all, we can get our priorities straight. So in terms of what we're teaching, the content of it, we should, recognize that the world is changing and make sure that what we're teaching is relevant for that. In terms of content, in terms of skills, and how we are training our students to use the technology effectively to be competitive in that market. And wherever possible, we can also integrate soft skills training by providing more varied learning experiences, using more case studies or real world scenarios wherever possible. Of course, probably we're already trying to do this, but it's something worth being reminded of, I think. And also teaching them how to get the information that they need or decide what information do I need and how to get it, and support each other in that, because community or kind of the social aspect is really important in that. And we can also just reduce the amount of information that we're presenting to them. Be more strategic about it. So there's a very nice mantra from a book called Essentialism, which is less but better. I think this is maybe something to kind of aim for if we are trying to make the cognitive load more manageable. And to keep in mind that it should be achievable, it should be useful, and it should be pleasant. And some guiding questions for that in terms of content, deciding which content should be prioritized, basically, is what is the most important and relevant for today? Could this be more visual or simplified somehow? Or if this is subtracted, will anything essential be missing? And we can also take some lessons from design, the field of design. There are some very useful principles that we can apply when we are, literally designing our materials, whether it be like handouts, worksheets, interactive tools, slides, anything like that. Is first of all, there is a pattern to how people process information. And the most dominant ones are called the F pattern, especially with regard to text. So there's a bias that we tend to read left to right and kind of focus more on the left and focus more on the top. We read in that way. And then for other types of inputs, there's also the Z pattern, which is again left to right and then down left to right. There's these biases that we can keep in mind. We can also use kind of visual principles like size and scale, color and contrast to show information hierarchies. So things that are bigger will be read first. And then kind of as you go down in size, that's going to affect kind of the order that information is processed. You can use color and contrast strategically. So there's a landing page here as an example. You can see maybe it takes a lot of effort to make out what's there. So just to kind of show you how this could work, using a bit more contrast, you can make the important information pop out a little bit. And also we can be really careful and strategic not to put too much text. To reduce text wherever possible, use headings to indicate kind of what they should take from this, and bulleted lists. And another aspect of this, which I've been thinking about a lot, is differentiating between what is really essential and what is kind of extra or for self-study support. So, at least I'm speaking from my experience teaching social and political science class in the university where I'm teaching. We are presenting a lot of information, and there's kind of this message like it's all important, all equally important. Like you need to read every single word of every single document, watch every single video in its entirety, pause it, take notes. But this is actually physically impossible. And the reality is that they have got a whole load of other classes. There's not enough time in the day, and not all of it is equally important. They need to develop this skill of deciding what is important now. What is most important now? So I think if we can differentiate that more clearly in how we set up our learning management systems, in how we communicate to our students, that can also make a big difference here. So maybe you're familiar with Strunk and White's classic, The Elements of Style. It's a writing guide. He has this mantra, omit needless words. So I would challenge you to omit needless anything. And if we do that with this example, which I showed you before, maybe we can take it from something like this to something like this. Simplify, eliminate, just put what is most relevant to make a decision to process it efficiently and emphasize that this is, kind of create a meta-awareness, let's say, in the students that they need to be applying this kind of strategy. Okay. And we can slow down or think about how much information we're giving at one time. So Sweller, who came up with the idea of cognitive load theory, he says that once appropriate information is stored in long-term memory, the capacity and duration limits of working memory are transformed, and indeed humans are transformed, because now that information has become part of your long-term schema and understanding of the topic, so you have more capacity to take in new information, basically. And in this process, tasks that previously were impossible or even inconceivable can become trivially simple. So the reason I bring this up is because I've seen it a lot in higher education where we have a lot of experience, especially the longer we spend, in our craft, teaching our subject. We become masters of our subject. We become experts. And we forget how it feels to be presented with that information for the first time, how overwhelming it is. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out here. So in terms of the information that we're releasing, maybe in terms of the materials, even in class as well, in terms of announcements or how we kind of interact with our students on the learning management platforms that we're using, we can think about, okay, what is my student's reality right now? What are they going to do with this information? Because for us, Monday morning comes and we sit down at 9 o'clock and we think, okay, we have some tasks. Our students need to be reminded of this. They need to do this. We need to, give them some instructions. And maybe we think of it as like a check off the tasks kind of approach. Oh, okay. And so, but for our students, maybe their reality looks a lot different on a Monday morning at 9 a.m. And maybe they're not prepared to take action on it right at that moment. So we can maybe just pace the release of this information. We can think, what is an appropriate time of day that my student can do something about this so that it doesn't just get added to their load and just contribute to more stress and make them more bored and less likely to learn, basically. Also, this is maybe kind of obvious, but we can build in opportunities for rehearsal and reflection. So any opportunity that the students can take to take a rest, consolidate their understanding, get feedback, apply that feedback. This is just basics of pedagogy, of course, but worth bearing in mind. Also, we can design particular kinds of assignments that can guide them in this process to help support them developing this skill of deciding, like taking in the information, doing something with it, and kind of reflecting on it, maybe distilling it, taking in more information. Anything we can do like that, like an e-portfolio, can help them acquire these skills. And this one also might be sort of obvious, since these are also basic pedagogical principles, but anything we can do to break down complex tasks. So dividing information into smaller, meaningful units, meaningful chunks, like that plus or minus 7 again. This would apply in terms of schema activation, using pre, during, and post activities for inputs, like readings or listenings, or anything we're asking them to do something with. Scaffolding to engage students in higher order thinking, and using various techniques to distribute this cognitive load through collaborative group work, for instance, through jigsaw readings, through interactive tools, through gamification of activities, or maybe reviews, to create this collective working memory effect, as it's termed, which will result in more engagement and critical thinking. I think this is kind of standard training that we all received when we started in teaching. And kind of as a last final strategy, I know it's very controversial, but training students how to collaborate with these new technologies like generative AI, like chatbot GPT, and other similar technologies to 80-20 the load. So if you're not familiar with the 80-20 principle, it's the idea that 80% of results comes from 20% of your effort. So if you can be strategic about how you allocate that effort, it's going to produce better results, basically. And so one kind of approach, in thinking about ChatGPT, is training students how to how to talk to that AI in a way that is going to kind of lay 80% of the groundwork for them that they can then interact with and bring to a much higher standard in order to be competitive in the knowledge economy, because that's what that's what smart people are doing, basically, to be competitive. That's the skill that's required. And if you've used ChatGPT, which I'm sure we all have tested it out a little bit, you see this kind of landing page, which gives the limitations about ChatGPT. So this can be maybe a nice guide of like what we can help our students discern and understand. Like maybe we can design particular kind of events that help them where they need to identify what is inaccurate about what ChatGPT has produced or something like that. Okay, and I recently saw an article in the Times Higher Education about ChatGPT as a teaching tool, not a cheating tool. They also put forth this idea of training students how to use ChatGPT as another feedback mechanism. So basically training them how to ask the right questions. And there's a lot of content being circulated right now about how to ask the right questions to ChatGPT. It's sort of key to using that as a tool. Of course, we want to be careful to walk that fine line of not having generative AI do the work for them and still developing the skills which are needed. But now that we have these tools coming out, we're only going to have more of them as time goes on. All right, thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with a final thought, which is to keep an open mind, because the skills that were useful and what was relevant for us to learn when we were students ourselves is not necessarily the same now, and as we move into the future, it's only going to become more that way. There's going to be more skills which are needed. It's going to affect how we're preparing our students for that world. So this is the end of my presentation, and here are my references. And here's my contact information. So I know I took up most of the time by speaking, but I think we have a few minutes for questions or to discuss. Maybe you have some idea.